Hello, I am the Ronin Pawn, and this is a Pawn Talk. Suck it, Ted. I've kind of let my dishes pile up for the last October, so I'm going to wash the dishes and I'm going to talk about something random, because I would usually stand here talking to myself, so why not throw a microphone and a camera in front of it? Let's talk about taxes. We live in a system where the poorest amongst us are taxed in order to pay the richest's bills. Don't we? Hang on, I gotta move some things here. This is not gonna make sense. In this country, we operate a system where the percentage that the rich pay in taxes, that corporations and large businesses pay, is actually less per annum than the poorest amongst us. You would think that there would be like a bottom limit on taxation, like, okay, if you don't make more than 12 grand a year, that's $1,000 a month. Just don't worry about it, okay? Get back to us when you're doing better. But no, as a person who actually most of my life has made around $12,000 a year, they still get my taxes. And you know, the thing is, I am fine with paying taxes because I see the value of it, because I want, for example, those bridges that are falling down all over this country that are in disrepair, critical pieces of infrastructure that if they collapse are going to kill God knows how many people. I'd like those repaired. I'd like the police department funded. I would like schools, public schools, to be available to anyone and everyone, regardless of their income, to a certain level of standardized quality. I see the value of a federal government taxing us. And as a matter of fact, I would like the federal government to tax us more, because I would be absolutely thrilled to put out more of my hard-earned dollar into a system that, instead of Obama-caring us, instead of requiring everyone in the country to buy privatized health care from the very corporations and the very for-profit industry that made it necessary for healthcare reform, instead of a system like that, I'd like to see healthcare massively regulated and possibly even just taken over by the federal government, taken over by an institution that doesn't have profit as its number one goal. And anyone who is still making the argument that the free market will regulate itself, or that the free market, left to its own devices, will find the best way, are you living in a cave? Do you not have Comcast? Because I have to get my internet through Comcast. I don't have, this sounds like I'm going off topic, but I'm not. I don't have any options out here where I live. It's Comcast or nothing. Comcast is the most hated corporation in America, and yet it has a monopoly. It has majority percentage of American customers use Comcast. Over 50% are using Comcast because they have to, because they've got a monopoly, and that allows Comcast to do whatever the hell they want. Okay, now I actually am digressing, and I do apologize. I just got notice by email the other day that there is now going to be a residential data cap on my internet. I can't use more than 1 terabyte in a month, or else Comcast is going to charge me $10 for every 50 gigs over that terabyte. As a content creator, that's not gonna fly. Now, they've given me the option of paying them an extra $50 a month in order to receive unlimited, no data cap residential service, which brings me up to, I believe, $110 a month I'll be paying just for internet. I don't even have television, just internet. $110 a month, pre-taxes. One of the other local cable companies in my area, WOW, that unfortunately doesn't service my home, but services my friends' areas, and so I know, part of their whole advertising pitch is that we don't have data caps. The other guys have data caps, we don't have data caps. Now, in a system where there's not a monopoly, you'd be forced to compete. And so you couldn't have data caps either, because someone else had figured out that they can deliver service and still make a profit without having data caps. Comcast doesn't have to do that. They don't have to compete. They've got a monopoly. And by virtue of a monopoly, they can do whatever the hell they want. And they can overcharge their customers, and they can not compete in the marketplace. Even though we have laws in this country that say you have to compete and you're not allowed to hold a monopoly. How do they do that? Well, the federal government doesn't really tax them the way they tax the poor, so they get to take all those extra tax dollars and give it to the government in a different way, by lining senators' pockets and buying legislation that keeps them having their monopoly, and being able to disregard antitrust laws. That's important too. See, I managed to bring it back to taxation, didn't I? I don't know if that's how I intended to do it from the outset, but I did it. Congratulate me. And what blows my mind is that the same people who call themselves fiscal conservatives and who just want the government's hands out of their pockets, and who would argue if the government were not taxing us, we could take our tax dollars and each and every one of us would have a higher quality of life because we'd be able to afford the things we want and need. And that would spur the economy, people would be able to buy things more, people would be able to have more services, which would mean small business would do better, and blah, 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 and yada, yada, yada. I don't disagree with that in theory. However, I do see the value of having taxation so that we can have public services. I would just like to see us tax the people who have the most instead of comping the people who have the most out of the wallets of the people who have the least. What blows my mind is that the same people who want Uncle Sam out of our pockets and to let go of our tax dollars so that we can all have a higher quality of life are the same people who support legislation that enables corporations to degrade the quality of life for everyone in America by enabling them to do things like maintain monopolies and disregard antitrust laws. It's the conservatives. It's those who call themselves fiscal conservatives who fall in the Republican camp who are constantly passing this legislation that makes it possible for corporations to take advantage of the American public, sell their products for prices that are far away and above what they need to get in order to be a viable company. To not really have to compete with the competitors that they have, to allow many corporations to jack the prices up as long as they all keep them in the same general area, as opposed to requiring them to present their products competitively, which, by the way, the tenets of capitalism and the free market economy simply do not work unless you have competition. It is required. Greed is not good unless it's tempered by competition. And where one organization manages to monopolize an entire industry and no longer has to compete, it really is the place of the federal government to step in and break that show up. Because if you don't break it up, you're reaching into the pockets of every American citizen and charging them far more for every product and service that's provided than is reasonable, that is justifiable. You're doing the same thing that the fiscal conservative would argue the federal government does in degrading the quality of life for American citizens by not having to compete. You're enabling the exact same thing to happen, just through a different source. And that's when you notice that those conservative representatives down on the floor who decry the federal government for taxing the American public and ruining their quality of life are actually just saying that so that they can weaken taxes so that their donors, their campaign donors, which are the big corporations and the people who have money, will be happy enough with them that they'll send another large donation their way next campaign cycle. Because otherwise, without that caveat, the argument falls apart, doesn't make sense. You cannot simultaneously claim that the reason you want less taxation is to raise the quality of life of the American public, and then also propose laws that allow corporations to maintain business practices which totally F over the American public and cost us all money and the quality of our lives. But you know what, I'm getting tired of bitching, so let's propose an alternative. Let's propose some tax code. How about we start by 1, making corporations actually pay their tax bills, since that would bring in a massive amount of money that the federal government has not had access to, and allow us to make sure that those bridges don't crumble when we're on our way to work. How about, at the same time, we set ourselves a minimum in the tax code and say, if you are a single taxpayer, an individual who's not making more than X dollars a month, Just don't worry about it. No need to file. We won't come looking for you. How about, instead of maintaining a tax code and tax operation so convoluted and complicated that the IRS itself is screaming at the federal government saying, we can't keep up. We don't know what you're doing. Stop passing legislation that changes the tax code in benefit of the corporations. How about we very, very simply ask those who are making more money and therefore have more to give without losing the security of their lives to pay a higher percentage, because they have the money to pay, and because we all like our bridges not falling on our heads. Or out from under our feet. Okay, I don't want to leave you surface dwellers out of this argument. You know, the problem is that everybody wants to be a frickin' lotto winner. Everybody thinks that, ooh, someday I'll be the guy who's making a whole bunch of money, and when I am, I don't want Uncle Sam dipping into my pockets. And what we've created is a system where if you're below a certain level, you are totally screwed. And if you're above a certain level, everything gets easier. Everything gets easier, and the problem with that system is that about 60% of the country lives below that imaginary line. They get taxed harder than the corporations get taxed, and then they get taxed again because instead of having social services provided by the government that are actually provided by the government, more often than not, you end up paying for them. Here in Michigan, it's called the Secretary of State, but most states have the DMV. When you go to the DMV, is anything just paid for? Is anything free? I mean, you can't even get an ID in a country where now we have, in some states, laws that require you to have an ID to vote. You have to pay to get an ID, which means I guess you don't have the right to vote unless you've got the money to vote. The poor and the lower class and the middle class, which I really could give a two shits about with the complaints of the middle class, Mr. and Mrs. Oh, I make $120,000 a year and I'm really doing bad. The government was really taking... Shut the fuck up. I live in a $2,500 house on the streets of Detroit. I pick bullets out of my front yard. I'm not interested in your 6-digit whining. The lower economic classes are taxed by the government and then taxed again whenever they try to use the government to do something. Damn you, daylight savings time. On top of that, the lower economic classes usually don't know and can't find the way to get access to the programs and the write-offs that they should have because they're lower economic classes. They don't have a tax attorney, they don't have an advisor, and they usually don't have the time to go and study this stuff. And let's not paint a completely unrealistic picture of the people who populate the lower economic classes. It's usually because they didn't have the greatest education. They didn't have a leg up when they got started like some of us did. So even just trying to understand what their obligations to the tax code are every year is kind of tricky, especially when you consider that the IRS itself is literally screaming at the federal government saying, this is too complicated, we don't even get it. And I'm not just talking out of my butthole there, the IRS has literally made that statement. When you think about it, it absolutely boggles the mind to imagine that we are where we are right now, that in all of the development, the evolution of government, of politics, of taxation, over the course of thousands of years of humans being on the surface of this planet, this is where we would end up today in America. And the only way that after all that, we end up with a system like this, you must admit, is that there are very powerful people with a lot of money who have a vested interest in the system being this way, because it benefits them. Doesn't benefit you, or me, or any of us really, but it benefits them. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just being aware and asking the question, who in their right mind would create a system of taxation where those who have the most pay less than those who have the least? And there's a very obvious answer. Those who have the most would create that system, using the power and the influence that they have by having the most. Anyway, that's the dishes done, and I think we've come to the end of this diatribe. Don't forget to vote for me in 2018. That's Ronan Pawn. Look for me on your ballot. I'm sure that our broken democratic system won't actually allow me to be on your ballot. And if you live in Michigan like I do, then you won't even be allowed to write me in. Let's talk about that next time Pawn out. And now I can conveniently look and see how long it took me to do the dishes. Oh my God. I should probably just do my dishes when I'm done eating out of them.